Hello and welcome to a new Thursday here on Viking TV and a new month. It's already February, can't believe it. And another week nearer to a return to normality, question mark. It certainly is just beginning to feel that way. And we will tell you as soon as there is any news about when Viking expects to be back to a full sailing schedule. And you too can look forward to a holiday like I am. I hope you feel like me that there is light at the end of the tunnel now, with all the news of vaccine rollouts. Though I suppose we have to concede that the tunnel is still pretty dark and gloomy at the moment. I was trying to lift the spirits of one of my sons this week, who is in full quarantine at his college, and he's losing patience with the pandemic, and he feels it's hitting his generation particularly hard. I think it is very difficult for young people at the moment to see that this era too will pass. And then I remembered the words of an incredibly inspirational man who we sadly said goodbye to this week, the 100-year-old British World War II veteran who vowed in the middle of last year that he would walk 100 laps of his own garden as a sort of fundraiser before his 100th birthday. And here he is, the amazing Captain Ton, being knighted by the Queen. And no wonder, because not only did he complete his marathon, but his story went viral right across the world, and he ended up raising £33 million. I think that's about 40-something million dollars for our National Health Service here in Britain. Now, sadly, he died this week, but in a way, all you can say is great tribute to him, but it was a life well lived, and that was noted in tribute from world leaders in Buckingham Palace, in Downing Street, right from the Elysee Palace, right through to the White House. But when I heard about my guest this week, I immediately messaged my son, the one in college, saying that everything was hitting his generation hardest. And I said, why don't you watch right now? Because if there was ever a story of human endurance and survival and the triumph of the human spirit, then this is it. So, meet a young military cadet called Porter Halyburton. This is him at the Sewanee Military Academy in 1959 at the tender age of 18. Good-looking young chap, eh? And here he is again with the lovely young lady, Marty, who would become his wife, graduating from college in 1963. And there they are getting married a bit later on in the same year. Well, we're going to get a chance to meet Marty this evening too, in a short while. But of course, that was the time of the Vietnam War. And when Porter joined the Navy and completed his flight training, well, he was deployed almost straight away to fight in Vietnam, flying Phantoms. And that meant leaving behind his young wife and 5-day-old baby daughter. It would be, listen to this, 7.5 years before he would see them again. I find it actually difficult to say that. It was 7.5 years of pain and suffering, during which he was presumed dead, and his wife had to accept that. And he often thought he might be better off dead. 7.5 years of that sort of suffering. Just saying those words feels so chilling, and yet my guest is one of the most inspirational and uplifting people you could meet, which is why I'm very proud to introduce you to him right now. From his home in North Carolina, please meet Porter Halyburton. Porter, lovely to see you.
Nice to see you, Anne. Wonderful to be with you.
Now, I wasn't sure, should I address you by a military rank? Because you're a commander, aren't you?
Well, I retired as a commander, yes. I was a brand new Lieutenant JG when I was shot down. I was a lieutenant commander when I came home, so I skipped over a whole rank.
Gosh, you were promoted while you were in prison, actually.
Yes.
How extraordinary. And just to tell everybody that amongst your many awards and decorations, oh my goodness, I forgot to turn off my phone. Isn't that terrible? Amongst your many decorations, I think you were awarded the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and 3 Air Medals. Am I right there?
7 air medals and 3 Bronze Stars.
Oh my goodness. And you certainly, I mean, if anyone knows your story, you will know why you deserved them. When you were so young, you were aged about 24, as I said earlier, the same age as my son, who's in college at the moment. Did you know much about where you were going? Did you know much about Vietnam? Did you care much about the politics?
I did not know very much. I had heard, of course, that the war was starting up. That I knew a little bit about why we were there, to stop communism, to try and make sure that South Vietnamese people were free and not overtaken by communism. But beyond that, I didn't know a hell of a lot. I really didn't.
If you look at the picture of the map of Vietnam, I understand that you flew something like 75 missions in 6 months, which sounds extraordinary.
That's right. Yeah.
And there we have another picture, I think, of you beside your Phantom F4 fighter with your pilot Stan Ormsted, who was the pilot with you on your very last mission.
Right. Mm-hmm. He was killed.
He was killed, yes, and you were presumed killed, because I understand that when you did go down, there were the Navy overflew the area several times to see if there was any chance you could have survived, and they concluded you couldn't have.
Well, nobody saw my ejection. Nobody saw a parachute. Nobody heard any radio transmissions, and so the conclusion was, the airplane flew into the side of a karst ridge and blew up with all the ammunition and the gas and everything that we had. So everybody assumed that we were both killed, but I had ejected right before.
What did happen? You talk a lot in all of the talks you do and everything you've ever written. You talk a lot about the freedom of choice. If people take a lot of your freedoms away from you, you still have choice over some things. And you even discovered choice in those few moments before the plane crashed. You had to choose between whether you would eject or whether you would stay with the plane and crash and die. What the choice you made was to eject, but do you remember why?
I do. It seemed like it was a long time that I was making a decision, but it was probably less than 10 seconds or so. And I thought, do I want to just go down with the airplane with Stan? Or do I want to take my chances at being a prisoner of war in the hands of the Vietnamese? And that was a pretty horrible prospect. And I thought of my wife and my newborn daughter, and I said, I have to take that chance. And so that's the first important choice that I made. And throughout my captivity, I realized that the great freedom that we have was to make that choice, no matter what circumstance you're in, no matter how bad it is or how constrained you are, you still have a choice about a lot of things. And the most difficult one is to choose your attitude. And that was the thing that made all the difference in the world, was to be able to feel that you had control over your life. And so you were not entirely a prisoner.
Exactly. I mean, you were taken to the prison that we now famously know as the Hanoi Hilton, which, although I think the picture we have is of it taken in later years when it looks a little tiny bit more acceptable. At least there's green leafy areas around it, but it must have been awful when you were taken there. And you were just, as I keep saying, 24. I can barely believe it. You must have been terrified. Were you? Were you prepared in any way for that?
Well, I had, of course, been through survival training, SEER school, and so on, and so I was prepared in a way for a lot of this. But I was more terrified of the unknown, You know, I expected the worst, and the worst did not occur until a year or so later, when they really got rough. But the rest of it was just, you know, horrible living conditions and food and everything else. And they tried to take away all of our freedoms. You know, we couldn't speak out loud. We couldn't communicate with anybody. We couldn't really do anything except, as they say, sit in your cell and think about your crimes. And it was all about indoctrination and all of that. And so over time, we found, though, that you can adjust to almost anything. And
that's the astonishing moral of your story. One of the things, we go back to the theme of choice, is that's what one of the nasty tricks they kept playing with you, is they gave you the choice. They said, if you cooperate with us and you give us certain information, then you can have better living conditions. You can talk to your friends. You can play games with them. But if you don't cooperate with us, you will have worse conditions. And of course, you did what I suppose we consider the right thing. You decided that you would not cooperate. So it was always the worst choice you ended up with.
So I did every time move to a worse place. And, you know, I was moving from this tiny little cell in Heartbreak Hotel in what we called, Heartbreak Hotel, which was the worst place I'd ever been in. And so there it is. And so when I moved, each place was worse in a different way. You know, the next place I moved to was bigger, but it was worse in a different way. And so each one of those choices became more difficult. And then the last place I was in was just this place that was unimaginably horrible, completely isolated from anybody else. I couldn't even tap on the wall to anybody. I could look through the crack and see what was going on. I was terribly sick. I didn't think I could survive from that place. And they gave me this choice once again. And that's the hardest choice I think I've ever made in my life, because I didn't see how I could survive either choice. And yet it turned out to be.
Well, I was going to say, ultimately, the worst choice they thought they could possibly throw at you was throwing you into a cell, a tiny, tiny, awful cell, with Fred Cherry. Can you explain what their thinking was behind that?
Well, I think they had a stereotypical view of American society and the issue of racism, which is all in our minds right now, and that as a young Southern white boy, of course I hated blacks, and to be put in with one who was so terribly injured that he couldn't do very much for himself, and to be told that I had to essentially wait on him, to be his servant. I think that they thought that would really be the last straw for me, and possibly for Fred as well. But of course, that was the very best thing that they could possibly have done, aside from sending me home.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, yes, he was an Air Force pilot, wasn't he? And you were Navy. And I've heard you give a talk in one university, I think, or a military college, where you said, I had no problem with him being black, but being Air Force.
I know that was. I often laugh about that because the Air Force and the Navy have a friendly rivalry. But yeah, but it was
yeah, I was going to say the truth of it is that he was terribly badly injured, and you did save his life, and he says that. You saved his, but you saved each other's lives, didn't you? And what they didn't expect was that you actually did learn to get on extremely well, even though initially you were suspicious that each other of you might be spies.
Well, Fred was suspicious of me. He thought the Vietnamese were running in a Caucasian Frenchman as pretending to be an American to get information out of him. But as soon as I began tapping on the wall to the next cell, which the man Rod Knudsen was there, he was shot down on the same mission that I was. And so I was tapping on the wall to him, and so I explained to Fred how our tap code worked. And that's when he was convinced that I was who I said I was. So after that, we got along great.
Now, it's interesting you talk about the tap code, because I've been trying to understand it, and I just can't, but I'm not very good with maths. Basically, you were not allowed to talk to each other. Even though you might be able to hear each other, and you certainly heard each other's screams, but you weren't allowed to talk to each other. You couldn't even whisper. You were stopped from doing that. So you invented this tap code, and we can see a picture of the key to that. And basically, it's about the number of times you tap in a certain way that spells out a letter. And through this very, very long, convoluted process, you were able to communicate with each other.
We did, and that was the basis of most of our ways of communicating. We did not invent this. We had I think the fourth guy who was shot down, named Smitty Harris, happened to have heard a SEER instructor talk about this code that had been used in World War II by American GIs, tapping on the water pipes that went from one barracks to another in a prison camp. We know now it was at least 2,000 years old. The Greeks used it as a military code then. Of course, different letters in the boxes, but you're just identifying a cell, one little box, and once you do that, whatever is in that cell that's the information. And so across the top is A, B, C, and the first row, which is the first number, would be 1, and then the next number would be 3, and that takes you over to column 3.
Crumbs. I mean, that must have taken so long even to spell out the very basic of messages. But of course, you had time, I suppose, didn't you?
Well, you get, if you use this enough, it becomes like a Morse code operator, not thinking about dots and dashes. I'm not thinking about numbers. I'm hearing the message, or it's just automatic. So we had many different ways to implement this same sort of idea, transmission of numbers 1 to 5. That's all it was. If you could transmit numbers 1 to 5, you could communicate.
As well as that sort of way of, I suppose it was keeping your brain working as well, since physically you were in such bad shape. There were some incredible stories you've told over the years of the heroism of some of your fellow the inmates. There was one story about a young man who put his own life at risk every night to crawl across the beams of the ceiling to get to another inmate who was being deliberately starved.
Right. His name was Bob Purcell. We called him Percy, and he was a little wiry guy, a great leader. He was an Air Force captain at the time, mid-grade, and he was one of the most amazing leaders that we had at that level. And he would do these incredible things. And he figured out a way to get up into the overhead of this cell block and go down. And he took his own food, which he had made into little pellets. I mean, he didn't have much to share, but, he took what he could. And he stuffed it down the hole where the light fixture came. And if he had been caught doing that, it would have been viewed by the Vietnamese as an escape attempt. And people died for that. People were tortured to death for escape attempt. So that was the most courageous thing that he did, in addition to the amazing thing that he could get up into this hole in the first place, which was damn near impossible, but he figured a way to do it. So he's one of my great heroes. He's not with us anymore, but his memory certainly stays with me all the time. And there were many heroes there, but I think Percy was the one that I'd lived with him many times and right up to the end. But of course,
and then you guys set yourselves mental sort of exercises to keep your brains really sharp, and also physical exercises. But mentally, I gather that it was, I mean, I know you did it, and others did too. You sort of categorized in your mind various thoughts. You kept things in alphabetical order. You memorized everybody's name in the order that they'd been shot down, in the order of the country they came from and the state they came from, things like that. And you were actually able to sort of almost like run it like a computer in your brain.
Well, we couldn't write anything down, and so except maybe temporarily. But the Vietnamese didn't allow us to write anything, and so we had to rely on our memory, our brains. And I don't have a very good memory at all, and so I really had to work very hard at it. And the names that we memorized, I think by 1968 I had 350 names, and they were memorized in about 4 different categories, alphabetically and by rank and service and all of that. But we felt that was important to keep track of everybody. We wanted to make sure that nobody fell through the crack. I didn't know that I was one that could very well fall through the crack. But so if you escaped or were released or had some other way of transmitting these names, then you had them. And we tried to keep track of everybody. So that was very important.
As we'll learn later, it actually benefited you, or at least your wife at one stage. But did you, I mean, we won't go into torture and anything like that now. And I know one of your fellow inmates was a very good artist and has drawn lots of pictures of some of the things that were done to people. And there's no way we want to go into that now or put you through even telling us about it right now. But I think we all accept that your treatment was completely dreadful. Can't even imagine how you got through 7.5 years. But at any stage, did you give up? Did you think, I'm never going to get home, I'm going to die here?
I think only once, and that was during the Hanoi March. You know, when we bombed Hanoi for the first time, their oil and lubrication and gasoline storage and processing, that really, really got to them, and they sort of took it out on us and said that we were going to be put on trial as war criminals and executed. And President Johnson, I didn't agree with a lot that Johnson said, but he did say, if you do that, I'm going to level Hanoi with B-52 bombers. And so they did not put us on trial. However, we barely escaped our lives as a result of that march, which wound up being a gauntlet with Vietnamese who had been egged on, just throwing everything at us. And I just I expected a knife to come, you know, right through, and that was going to be it. And we were very lucky to get out of that alive.
And yet so many times in recent years, you've written that it is possible to accept your fate and to still try and live a meaningful life.
Oh, I think so. I think, as I later learned from Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, I had not read that before I was shot down, but I certainly did afterwards. And that explained so much about how we reacted to our environment and what was important. And he said, you know, that man's most basic need is to discover the meaning in their life. And if you fail to do that, then it turns to various mental conditions and so on. And so, as a psychotherapist, he used this logotherapy in treating his patients, trying to help them to discover the meaning in their life. And once you do that, then that is therapeutic. But it explained, I think, a lot of our actions there, that we were trying to lead a meaningful life, even in this terrible condition where we had no freedoms at all. And yet we found out that we could do that. And so that became our great motivation. And so I guess my creed was, I'm going to stay as active as I possibly can, mentally, physically, and spiritually. And so every day I tried to break up that day into those three kinds of activities. And so I still do that.
And that sounds like a good lesson to us all. I know that you set yourselves between some of you, when later on you were able to talk to each other a bit, you set yourself some silly competitions. Like there was a knee bend competition that you decided to do that would take all night, so you couldn't sleep, but right. you literally indulged yourself in see how many knee bends you could do in one night.
Well, it was a competition, and after a while, there was only two of us in the competition. That was Bunny Talley and myself. He was an Air Force officer that I was living in the group that I was living with, and so we started off doing several hundred and then several thousand, and I wound up doing 6,000. But it took almost all night to do that, and then Bunny did 7,000. And that took all night, meaning from the time the door was closed until it opened up in the morning. And I knew you couldn't do more than 7,000. So I let him have it.
Yeah, absolutely. You clearly deserved it. And there were little things like that do put a smile on your face. Like you were determined to try and learn German if you could. Yeah. And so what you had to do is identify somebody in the camp who could teach you a little bit of German. But the guy you got was, he didn't know very much more German than you did. And so where he didn't know something, you just made up words.
Right. Well, I did wind up living with somebody that knew German pretty well, but he didn't know everything. We had no textbook or dictionary or anything. And so if we needed a word that we didn't know, we just made it up. And German is so wonderful about that, constructing a word out of several other words. And so a rabbit became a hippenhopper. And the duck was a Schwimmenquacken, and after I came back home, I wanted to go to graduate school, and so I wanted to take some undergraduate courses before I did that, and so I asked my advisor, and I said I'd like to take German, and he said, well, why don't you take the equivalency? And I passed first year college German based on what I had learned in Hanoi. And so then that was not a unique experience. There were a lot of people there that learned German, French, Spanish, even Russian, based on who they were in contact with. So we had pretty vigorous educational and physical and mental process.
There was a very nice story you told once, I think, of an inmate who you couldn't see. So you asked him to describe himself to you. Can you remember that story? Go on, tell us.
I do. He was the only person that I could tap to, and it was a very difficult time. And the only thing, and it was very difficult to communicate. My hands were handcuffed behind my back, and I had to back up to the wall, tap very, very lightly on the wall, and we became great friends through the wall. And then one day I realized I'd never seen him, so I asked him, "What do you look like anyway?" And he said, "John Wayne." And he's a Marine. He was a fighter pilot, and so I said, "Okay, he's 6'2" and broad shoulders, narrow hips, rugged, good looks, and all of this." And so I accepted that. I put that with everything else I knew about Howie, but I didn't ever see him again. Didn't know any. He was a Marine, one of few Marines, and so at the very end, we met. And he comes up to me and he sticks out his hand and he said, "Hi, I'm Howie Dunn." And I said, "Howie, you son of a bitch, you lied to me." And we got a big laugh out of it. He said, "I know, but it was such fun knowing the image that you had of me," because he was short and bald, and there he is. He's pretty ruggedly good looking guy, but very different than John Wayne. So it goes to show, I tell that story because it illustrates the power of this communication, numbers 1 to 5. And yet he was my best friend. He was my senior officer. We got through the terrible time together just because we could tap on the wall very lightly at great risk.
Even with your hands tied behind your back. It's just incredible to most of us listening now and watching you thinking, how do you ever get through that? And look at you. And I know that when ultimately, and I cannot believe it's 7.5 years, but ultimately when release did happen, you were able, as you left that camp behind you, to turn around and look at the gate and leave your hatred behind. Can you explain how you were able to do that?
Well, it was self-preservation, really. I had built up an incredible hatred for the North Vietnamese, for communism, for all that they stood for what they had done to us and to our families. They didn't even tell Marty that I was alive or my mother or anything. And and I found out that this hatred became a shield. If I hated them enough, they could never get through that. They could never convince me of anything unless that I knew for some other reason that it was true. And so it was very useful, this hatred. And I had said, when I get home, when I get out of here, these people are never going to adversely affect my life again. And so right at the very end, when we were talking about, what are you going to do first day when you get home? And, I had gotten a beautiful picture of Marty and my daughter, Dabney. And that's what I was thinking of. I want to be with them. I was pretty sure my grandparents and my mother had passed away. And so I heard some people, 2 guys, talking about what they were going to do to get back at the Vietnamese, revenge for what they had done to them. And I realized at that moment the horrible power that hatred has. And I knew I could not take that hatred home, because if I did, these people would still adversely affect my life. And I had already said I can't do that. So I just, as we left, I turned and said, "I forgive you." And it was the most liberating thing that I have ever done. It just, all of that hatred fell away. That armor that I had built up fell away. And I walked out of 2 prisons that day. And so I have eliminated hatred from my life. And
that is an amazing way to put it. You walked out of 2 prisons, and my goodness, the release when you knew you were going home must have been incredible. And then to meet with your wife Marty and your daughter, who you hadn't seen. There you are, being released.
That,
as you're about to board the plane, I think.
that's at the very at the loading ramp of the C-41, 141 that we came home in, and that's my friend Dave Wheat. That we were shot down the same mission as well.
I mean, funnily enough, you look quite well there. But I know that once they knew they were going to have to release you, they gave you toothbrushes and toothpaste and new clothes to put on. I mean, this was a bit of a sham, really, but you weren't broken. You were able to walk there, and you were able then to meet with your wife, Marty, and the little girl you hadn't seen since she was 5 days old. That's the photograph. I can't even imagine what you were feeling at that time. Do you remember?
Well, of course, I was just so overjoyed, to finally see her. I'd been living with these wonderful pictures that Marty had sent. Once we were able to communicate, I didn't get any letters or anything, or write any letters for 5 years. But after that, then we began to get them, and I had these wonderful pictures. And so I'm seeing pictures of my daughter, kind of growing up and writing poetry and songs and stuff about her and so on. So it was really almost like I knew her, before I met her. And so it was
extraordinary.
Indescribable. Yeah.
I can only imagine. At this point, I wonder if we can bring your wife Marty in to join you. It would be lovely to meet her, and maybe even, hear some of the story from her perspective too.
Yeah, he's
so,
right here.
Marty, you're there. How lovely to see you. Welcome. So you were a young mum. It wasn't so long since you'd actually just got married to this beautiful young man there. And yet you were told, he was dead, weren't you? I mean, what was life like for you at that point as a single mother in despair, I presume?
Well, as terrible as it was to be a widow at 24, I really convinced myself that death was better than having a husband who was a prisoner of war. Mm. And so then a year and a half later, when I learned he was a prisoner of war, I had to do an entire, just rethink everything. And in some ways, that was more difficult because I didn't know any information about him, whether he was terribly injured. I would hear news reports and see things that they were being tortured. And so in some ways, that was harder than the finality of death.
I think
yes, because the finality of death is something that you had not come to terms with, but you'd have to accept. Yeah. You even went to the point of having a memorial service and a tombstone.
Right.
And then to learn that he was, in fact, a prisoner of war. And as you just said, one of your worst nightmares was that he was probably being tortured, which he was. What were you able to do? I know you joined this amazing legion of women who decided to fight for their prisoner of war husbands and fight for somebody to do something about the conditions that they were being kept in.
Yes. As soon as I learned that Porter was a POW, the Navy put me in touch with Sybil Stockdale, who had started an organization, the National League of Families of American Prisoners and Missing in Southeast Asia. And so I met other women and mothers and fathers who were in my same situation. And we began initially, not a whole lot had been said about the prisoners. So we began just telling people our stories that we didn't know if our loved ones were dead or alive, and asking people to separate that humanitarian issue from the issue of the war itself.
Mm. Yeah, from the politics, exactly. And I know that that led you to doing many, many speeches. At one point, I think you even deputized for Bobby Kennedy, who couldn't make it or something. And instead, they said, "Could you speak?" And you stood up and spoke. And both of you have gotten to know people at the White House and all sorts of famous politicians and movers and shakers in that whole world. And you were able to get something done. But I just asked Porter there about the reunion. What was it like for you? And I look at that beautiful picture of you and Porter and your little girl, and I think, well, how did Dabney react? Because she didn't know this man who was her daddy, but you're hugging and she's clearly pleased to see you there.
It was, it's very difficult to describe. I had talked so much and lived the life with someone who wasn't in my presence. It's a little bit like today. We are loving people and caring for people, but we can't always be with them or see them or even, and so I talked about him. And when he came home, it was really almost like he'd gone to work shortly.
7.5 years of it.
I mean, people say that's crazy, but it wasn't all that strange.
And
go on, Porter.
Dabney, right away, we met, and then I think we got in the car, and she asked if she could sit in my lap.
Oh, that must have been wonderful.
I mean, it was amazing.
Absolutely. She must be an incredible person. But I now know that she's not your only child. You've had a much bigger family since. I think we've got a lovely picture of the family portrait. This was taken back in something like 1981, I think. Who's in that photograph there?
Well, Dabney is to Porter's right. I'm to his left. And then our second daughter, Emily, who was born in 1975. So there's 10 years difference between Dabney and Emily. And then 5 years later, our son, John Fletcher.
Oh, that's absolutely wonderful. And they're all grown up now and doing their own thing.
Yes.
And I presume you, like me, are pretty isolated at the moment, are you?
Yes, we are.
You keep up with the family by Zoom and things like that.
Zoom is the lifeline.
Well, absolutely. But I think a lot of people watching at the moment might almost be quite surprised to find that you have both built up a real relationship with Vietnam, the country, and the people since. You've both returned to Vietnam, and I gather, Marty, you've really fallen in love with Vietnam and its people.
I have. I think I had watched the war for 8 years on television, and I felt very fortunate because I was safe. I had everything I needed except for my husband, Porter. Dabney and I were well cared for by our government, our friends, and people we didn't even know. And I was watching women and children fleeing their burning villages, fleeing for their life. And so I was very curious about Vietnam. And in 1998, it opened to the Western tourists, but very few were interested in going. And a group of POWs decided to go. And Porter initially wasn't interested, but I was going to go on my own. And finally, about 2 weeks before the trip, he changed his mind. And it was, I think we were curious. A lot of people said, was this closure? And I don't think so, because what it ended up being was really an opening, not a closure. Meeting people there who had suffered through the war, but who told us when they realized that we were Americans, America number one. And we couldn't understand. Talk about forgiveness. They had forgiven all those who had fought against them. And so that was so heartwarming to me. I just couldn't get them out of my mind. It really changed my life. And I found several opportunities to go back and teach English as a second language in Hanoi. And I have many Vietnamese friends, and Porter and I have led a number of trips to Vietnam.
I
And
think that's
work with refugees.
It's remarkable, except I've never met anyone who's been to Vietnam and hasn't loved it. Apparently, it is the most brilliant country, isn't it? With the most gorgeous people.
Yes.
And I know that a lot of Porter, you are a real artist as well. I mean, a lot of the things that we probably see around you now are a product of your own hands and your own handcraft. I gather you're a potter and a craftsman, and you make things that are very often very reflective of your time in Vietnam, or at least an appreciation of that culture.
Well, I've always been interested in art and working with my hands and everything. So I have done a lot of things, and I am doing pottery and woodworking, making wooden boxes and many other things. So it's a way of keeping busy and doing something that is satisfying and so on. So yeah. It's
an awful lot more than that. You are quite an artist by the look of it, isn't he, Marty?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. He's understating that, I think. And a poet. And we mustn't forget that you wrote some extraordinary... There's an example of one of your pots, which is absolutely... oh, and look at that. That's a tea box, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely beautiful. I mean, that's not just keeping you busy. that is real artistry. Excuse me. We've got lots and lots of people getting in touch. And there you are. Reflections on Captivity, which is just one of your poems, written. Actually, Porter, was that written while you were in prison or afterwards? Because obviously you couldn't have written it down at the time.
Well, it was written while I was there. And it was one of several poems that I wrote to try and describe our environment and our reaction to our environment in a way. And so I wrote, I think, eight poems while I was there, probably more because some of them I put to music. And particularly one that I wrote about Marty. It started off as a poem, and then eventually, as I got interested in and met and lived with some people who were great musicians and everything, and could, and so I wrote maybe a dozen songs as well, and so some of them were poems, but usually it was just trying to describe, how I felt about things at the time. And the reflections on captivity, I think, really captured it pretty well. And I use that as the title of, I am hopefully going to publish a book about some of our experiences. And the title, at least part of it, will be Reflections on Captivity.
You don't have it in front of you, do you? You couldn't read it for us, could you?
I could.
Knowing your memory, you could probably say it.
I have a terrible memory. I can't even. I
think we would all love to hear you say it if you wouldn't mind. And it's lovely, Marty, by the way. I mean, anyone who's ever been married, I think it's lovely to see you with your arms around each other. I really do. After all you've been through, it's just lovely to see you together. But go ahead, please do, Porter. Tell us, recite your...
How can I measure the loss of my dimensions as I lie spread across this crass expanse of time, bitter years, devoid of latitude or luster? My duty days of trial and decision, or but pages turned, but pages not forgotten. Those countless hours of aimless retrospection, regret, restraint, and introspection, the strange monotony of unrewarded hopes, unconquered hopes, amidst my unborn tears, have tempered the metal of my structure and filled the empty spaces of my soul.
Gosh. Unrewarded hopes they may have felt like at the time, but in the end they were rewarded, weren't they?
Yes.
Yeah. We've got so many people in touch with it. I mean, not going to be able to answer all of these questions, but Patrick from Hilton Head Island says, what behavioural attributes were the key to your survival during the 8 years of being a POW? Is it possible to name those?
Oh, behavioral attributes. I'm not sure. I hadn't thought of that in that way. I think you had to have a certain determination. You had to have a certain amount of faith. You had to have a certain amount of courage, and some of those things were very difficult. But I think they were things that got us through. I think the fact that we were able to communicate with each other. I can't emphasize how important communication is, even today. I mean, thank God we have Zoom and Skype and all of that in order to stay in touch with people that we can't physically be with. But I know that the Vietnamese tried to isolate us, keep us from talking to each other, keep us away from our leadership, prevent us from making a military organization or any of that, because they wanted to indoctrinate us. They wanted to use us in their prosecution of the war against the U.S. And so, you know, we had to get together, and we had to become a military unit, and we had to resist everything that they did. And so it was those things that allowed us to do that. And
yes, I know you've always talked a lot about communication being the key. Let me ask, though, the person who probably knows you best, other than yourself, Marty, what do you think is key to his survival? What is it about him that has led to his survival, do you think?
Well, I think his active mind and willingness to accept the situation he had and make the best of it.
Gosh,
I think we found that in many ways we were not as tough as we thought we were. I mean, we were all kind of broken to some degree under torture. We couldn't just continue to say no. And yet we found out that we were so much tougher in other ways, you know, that we could always, we created what we call the second line of resistance. If you cannot physically resist anymore, you have to come up with other ways to resist. And for example, the Vietnamese did not speak, some of them spoke English, some of them spoke English rather well, but it was not American English. And they did not know American culture. They did not know American humor. They didn't know American sign language. And so these were things that we could use against them. We discovered their weaknesses and so on. And so I think it was this determination, you know, to overcome and adjust to any situation. And we found out that the human body and mind is much more adaptable and tough than we think it is. You can adapt to almost anything.
I remember you talking at one occasion about whenever, oh, I'm so sorry, that's my phone again, and I thought I'd turned it off. I don't even know where it is. Oh, I had turned it off, but I don't understand the technology properly. You'd actually made up your minds another way to resist, and again in a cultural way which they wouldn't understand, was that if you were ever asked to be in a photograph or do anything for propaganda purposes, you would always quietly put the finger up somewhere. Yeah.
And they didn't know that, and I'm sure one of their Chinese or Russian buddies were probably looking at all these photographs and said, "Do you know that they're giving you the finger here?" And what that it just negated all these pictures that they had taken, you know.
Yeah. And so it's finding things like that. It's a form of resistance, I suppose, isn't it? We have so many other people getting in touch. Bill Henderson, or Bill from Henderson in the United States, or Bill Henderson saying, Oh, yeah. Hello from Bill Shankle, he says. So glad you're enjoying your life after our incarceration. Viking is a lovely cruise line, he says. Julie and I have enjoyed cruising with them. Would be fun to meet on a cruise sometime. So this is obviously somebody you know.
Oh yeah, Bill Shankle was he was actually one of the times I was tortured. Bill was in the next cell, and was a great comfort to me during that time. And so yeah, we're great friends. Hi, Bill.
Atty and Lara say, dear Porter and Marty, looking forward to watching your presentation. Yes, they are from the Viking Venus. They say, we hope we can all reunite on a Viking vessel in the near future, because you guys have been on a world cruise, haven't you not?
Yes.
We
The
have.
inaugural world cruise.
Wow.
The first one that Viking did. And
that's how we discovered you, I think. That's how Karina Hagen discovered you and invited you on tonight, which is brilliant. There's so many. Edie says, you have my utmost respect and admiration, and thank you for your service and sacrifice. My husband and I toured the prison in November 2019 on a trip to Vietnam. And in a picture my husband took of me in one of the cells, there is a strange image or aura that appears to be some sort of spirit or ghost. Did you ever experience anything weird like that?
I can't say that I saw images. I certainly had feelings. I remember in my first cell in Hanoi Hilton, in the little section, you showed a picture of that cell.
Yeah.
And I got there, and the smells in that cell were all alien. I'd never smelled things like that. And I, at the time, did not know that that was a prison built by the French to keep Vietnamese prisoners there, and that the leg irons were built to hold Vietnamese legs. And yet now they were holding mine. And I felt this incredible sort of presence of all these other prisoners, Vietnamese prisoners who had been held there, and just the walls seemed to be soaked in misery. And so there wasn't a visual, but there was this smell that drew up these images. You know.
John from Conway in the US says, did any of your personal captors ever show anything that would indicate that any degree of sympathy, either with you or with your conditions in their prison? Did any of them try to alleviate some of the worst? Did they understand what they were doing to you?
They understood what they were doing to us, and there were people have asked that question before, and I say there were only 2 instances where they showed any sort of humanity at all, and one of them was when I was with Fred Cherry, and they had operated on his shoulder, and he's in this body cast with his arm out like this. You probably can't see, but from his wrist all the way down to his waist. And so I am trying to take care of him, and I did a lot for him. But the one thing that I was not going to do was chew off his fingernails. No. Because his fingernails were getting long and dirty and so on. Yeah. And so we had this turnkey, the guy that opened the door every day. And I pointed to Fred's hands and his long, dirty fingernails. And he actually went away, came back with this little pair of clippers. And he let me clip Fred's fingernails. That was one time.
Yeah.
The other was I was out in a prison out in the country. It was actually the one in which we were tortured the most, and I had to carry our honey bucket, down to this place where we dumped it, and that was all. We did everything at night. It was pitch black dark, and I'm carrying somebody else's bucket as well. I'm in shower shoes, essentially. The ground is rough and so on, and the guard has a lantern or a flashlight. And usually he's shining it so he sees where he's going, and I'm following along, tripping, trying not to drop these buckets and everything. And one night he shone the light in my path so I could see where I was going. So those are the only two instances that I can think of in which they did anything that showed any respect at all.
Any degree of or empathy in any way at all. Lots of people getting in touch saying, "Did you know John McCain while you were in the Hanoi Hilton?" Because he was there too.
He was there. He was there for about 5 years. I did not. Of course, I knew he was there. I knew who he was. I knew people who knew him. But I never lived with him or anything. We got to be very good friends afterwards. And so up until the point in which he became a politician.
Yeah, yes, that's right. Well, I guess we leave it there. Yes, a lot of people saying, God bless you for your service. Thank you very much. So inspiring, especially at the moment. And I just wonder if that makes you think about what's happening to us all at the moment. Whether, I don't know, how do you reflect upon what we're going through now and how we as human beings and as people who love each other, how are we meant to get through these months of quarantine and isolation?
Well, I think I've been asked to, talk about that, both where we live now and otherwise. And, I try to get across to people that you can really get adjusted to almost anything. I mean, we live in this wonderful environment here where we don't have to worry about very much, but there's so many people who have lost their jobs. They're hungry, they're in terrible conditions. And so the only thing I can say is, that if you don't feel sorry for yourself, just try to make the best of everything you can. And you can get through the most terrible thing you can imagine. And so I hope I've had some people say that made some difference.
Lots of people are asking as well, what happened to Fred Cherry?
He lived until he was 87 years old. And we were friends for all of that time. I'd see him 2 or 3 times a year. And he, in spite of his terrible, terrible injuries, he's one of the most tough guy I've ever met, I think, and the most patriotic. Of course, he grew up in a segregated South and all of that, and yet he never felt animosity about that. I mean, he wanted to prove while he was a prisoner. He wanted to be an example of courage and perseverance and all of that. And he certainly was.
He was.
A great inspiration to me. I mean, I in living with him, I learned so much about that. And he was the most patriotic. I mean, he was just an amazing guy. And so I was very privileged to live with him and get to know him and to know him after we came home for all of those years.
Sadly for him, his marriage didn't survive that incarceration and that separation, but yours did. And look what an incredible marriage it has turned out to be. So what is the secret? I mean, how difficult was it for you to reunite after all those years of separation? And how have you made such a go of it all the time? I mean, go on, give us the secret.
Well, I think there are 2 things. There's love and respect. And you have to have both of those things. And I think that we do. And I think that our marriage has always been a partnership, and we share. I know that there were a lot of divorces among some of the guys who came back who were maybe type A individuals who thought that they would move back into the family life and take over from where they left off, you know, when they're in making all the big decisions and everything. And of course, these wives had been back here all this time, making all of those decisions, raising kids, doing everything. And you weren't just going to move back. and so I think the recognition that we both had our roles to play and that we worked hard at making our marriage work.
Is that how you see it too, Marty?
Yeah, good job.
Just wondering if you had a completely different perspective, you know. It's wonderful to see you. It really is. You are the most inspirational people I could ever hope to meet. And I do hope I will meet you one day, perhaps on another Viking cruise, which you obviously seem to enjoy going around the world. Where in the world would you like to go next?
We want to go to Turkey and Greece, I think. Yeah.
Won't be long, I don't think. Not too long.
We have not been to those places, and we've been most others.
Yeah, by the sound of it. Well, look, thank you so much for being with us this evening. It's been absolutely brilliant to meet you. It really has. And if anyone wants to read more or hear more about you, I have been absolutely enjoying researching you on YouTube and books and everything. It's been an absolute honor to meet you, Porter, but also to meet Marty as well, and to discover that, you know, there is a way through some of the darkest times, and you have proved that, and it's wonderful to see it. So thank you very, very much indeed for joining us.
It's been an honor to be with you. Thank you
so much. And let me just tell everybody about next week, because next week on Viking TV, it's Danube Week. And my guest is going to be Professor Thomas Elmer, who's the owner of the famous Viennese dance school. Now, Vienna, I am told, still hosts hundreds of balls every year. Well, I suppose in normal years. And Professor Elmer is the man who teaches debutantes how to dance and behave, maintaining centuries of wonderful old traditions. And if you are lucky enough to be on a Danube cruise as a Viking guest, you can also have the chance to learn how to waltz with him at his dance school. He even taught our lovely Karina how to waltz with him on a visit to his dance school. Yeah, she famously said, as he said, I will teach you how to waltz. She said, I've never had to follow a man or let a man lead in my life before, but she let him through the waltz. Anyway, he's going to be fascinating, and I'm sure he'll have wonderful stories to tell us. And until then, all I can wish for you is to have a happy and safe few days until I can be with you again. The light at the end of the tunnel is going to be another week nearer, I reckon. And just to prove that, today, Viking celebrated the laying of the keel for their latest ocean cruise ship, the Viking Mars. You can see it behind all of the workers and engineers who've made it possible. And can you spot the ship behind it, I wonder? Oh, yes. If we just pull back a bit, I think you will be able to see it, because the ship behind it is none other than the Viking Venus. And that's the ship I've been asked to be a godmother to. She's completing her trials, being fitted out, and we're hoping she will be launched soon. And oh my goodness, as soon as we know what that date is, I will be launching rockets from the top of my little house here in Britain, and I will be letting you know first. Until then, warm wishes. Keep safe. Goodbye.